Hello, welcome to the New York School of Design Sewing Basics course. And once again, I'm Hannah Noth and I'll be your instructor for this series. Today we're going to dive into the world of seam finishes. Flat felled seams not only hide your raw edges and keep the fabric bulk nice and flat, but they also give the appearance of a twin needle look. Techniques. Let's begin with flat felled seams, which is very popular for sewing garments with denim. I'm going to take 2 pieces of fabric, I'll use muslin here, and I want you to place them right sides outside, wrong sides together. Okay, so that's the opposite of how you normally sew. Typically, your fabrics will be right sides together, but in this case, the wrong sides need to be together and the right sides are going to be outside. Place some pins in your fabric to hold the 2 pieces of fabric in place to help you sew a straight seam. And then you'll need to sew at a normal or wide seam allowance. You do not want a narrow seam allowance for flat felled seams, as you'll see why in just a moment. I'm going to sew this at a 5/8 seam allowance. And lay out this piece of fabric for sewing a flat felled seam. Now you can do this next part with an iron, or you can use your fingers and simply press the seam open. So now my seam is open. Now take your fabric scissors and trim one side of the fabric seam allowance, not both, just one, doesn't matter which one, so that's really narrow raw edge. I'll take my fabric scissors and I'm just going to go in, making sure to not cut into the actual seam that I just sewed, and I'm just going to begin cutting it down. Okay, so now I have one seam allowance that's still 5/8 of an inch and one that's really narrow. Now I'm going to take this wide seam allowance and I'm going to fold it over 2 times. In doing so, I will cover up the raw edge of this narrow seam allowance and also cover up this raw edge of the larger seam allowance. Here's how you do it. You're going to fold this large seam allowance over 1 time, just over that other seam allowance, and then fold it over again. So when you have it folded over 2 times, it's going to look like this. Make sure that you place plenty of pins in your fabric as you go down the seam, doing this because it won't want to stay in place without the pins. So I'm just continuing to go down the seam, still folding it over that short raw edge and back over again, hiding both of those raw edges of fabric, and placing another pin in. Okay, I think I'm just going to use one more pin to finish off the seam here. Okay, so now my whole seam is ready to be sewn. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down and I am going to edge stitch on this new fold that I just created. I'll be sewing through 3 layers of fabric, so I want to make sure I take my time and catch all those layers. And once I do that, my flat felled seam will be finished. So I'm going to use my flywheel to line my needle up with the beginning of my fabric. So I start off right where I want to be on edge stitching. And I'm just going to go slowly, making sure that I'm sewing in a straight line. Since remember, I'm using the fold of the fabric that I just created to guide me and not a traditional seam allowance. All right, there you have it. 2 parallel seams running down the length of the fabric. No raw edges peeking out on the inside or the outside. And I would recommend you iron this now too, so it lays even flatter and just has a more crisp appearance. The benefit of flat felled seams is they create hardly any bulk while taking care of your raw seams. So there you have it. That's a flat felled seam. And that concludes flat felled seams. I hope you learned a lot and are excited to practice these new seam finishing techniques. I'll see you then.